He called her ugly and cheated with her twin sister, but both sisters were mafia queens, and Vincent Romano was about to discover that some insults cost more than pride. They cost everything. Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Stella's Love Tales. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now because I love connecting with you all. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. It's going to blow your mind. Vincent's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he sat in the leather chair, the kind of chair that cost more than his car, surrounded by mahogany walls that seemed to close in with every breath he took. And the green banker's lamp on the desk cast shadows that made the two women standing over him look like avenging angels. Or maybe demons. He couldn't tell anymore because his brain had stopped processing reality the moment he realized what he was seeing. Two of them, identical faces, one in a black suit that seemed to absorb the light, the other in white that glowed like a threat. And both of them were staring at him with expressions that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The woman in black, Isabella, the one he'd been calling ugly to his friends for 6 months, while using her family connections to climb the social ladder, took a slow drag from her cigarette, and the smoke curled around her face like a living thing. And the woman in white, Gabriella, the one he'd been kissing in his car just 3 hours ago, while his wedding ring pressed cold against her cheek, swirled whiskey in a crystal glass that caught the lamplight and threw golden reflections across the Persian rug beneath his feet. Vincent's throat felt like sandpaper as he tried to form words, any words, but all that came out was a strangled whisper that sounded nothing like his own voice. Wait, Gabriella, Isabella, you two, you know each other? And the question hung in the air like a noose, waiting to drop. Isabella's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, if smiles could cut like knives. And she exchanged a glance with Gabriella that spoke of secrets. Vincent suddenly realized he was never meant to discover, and in that moment, in that terrible crystalline moment of clarity, he understood that he hadn't been playing them, they'd been playing him. The study around him came into focus with brutal clarity. The framed photographs on the walls showing men in expensive suits, shaking hands with people Vincent had only seen on the news. The antique revolver mounted in a glass case that suddenly seemed less like decoration and more like a promise. The chessboard on the side table, where 2 queen pieces stood tall, while a king lay toppled on its side. And Vincent's stomach dropped as he realized this wasn't just a room. It was a throne room, and he was kneeling before royalty he'd insulted without knowing their true names. Gabriella set her glass down with a sound like a judge's gavel, and when she spoke, her voice had lost all the sweetness she'd used when whispering in his ear just hours before. Know each other. Vincent? That's cute. Really cute. And Isabella finished the thought, as if they shared one mind. We're twins. Vincent. Identical DNA. Different mothers. Same deadly bloodline. Same family crest. And both women raised their left hands in perfect synchronization to show him the signet rings that caught the lamplight. Heavy gold with a symbol Vincent had seen before on buildings throughout the city, on businesses that never seemed to close, on the envelopes that made grown men nervous. The air in the room felt too thick to breathe, and Vincent's collar seemed to tighten around his throat, like invisible hands, and he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like drums announcing an execution. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was screaming at him to run, but his legs had turned to stone, and besides, he could see shadows moving in the doorway behind the twins, shapes of men who stood too still to be anything but guards. How had he gotten here? How had a simple affair turned into this nightmare? And more importantly, what did these women want from him because the way they were looking at him, like scientists observing an insect they were about to dissect, told him that whatever came next would redefine every assumption he'd ever made about power, about beauty, about the cost of calling someone ugly when you didn't know who they really were. Vincent Romano had always been a man who measured his worth in other people's perceptions, the kind of man who checked his reflection in every window he passed, and adjusted his tie before entering rooms because he believed presentation was everything. And 6 months ago, when his college friend Marcus— no, wait. When his college friend Daniel Chen had introduced him to Isabella Corleone at that networking mixer in downtown Manhattan, Vincent had seen opportunity wrapped in designer clothes and expensive perfume. Not a person, never a person, just a ladder rung to climb. Isabella had been different from the women Vincent usually pursued. She didn't giggle at his jokes or bat her eyelashes when he flexed his mediocre Wall Street credentials. Instead, she'd looked at him with dark eyes that seemed to see through his rehearsed charm, straight into the hollow space where his authenticity should have been. And she'd said something that should have been a warning. My family doesn't tolerate games, Vincent. We value loyalty above everything, even love. But Vincent had heard those words and thought she was talking about some old money dynasty that threw charity galas, not the kind of family that made people disappear when they broke the rules. The truth was that Vincent's deepest fear, the thing that woke him up at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, was being ordinary, being the guy who peaked in college and spent the rest of his life in a cubicle watching other men succeed. And Isabella's last name opened doors that his own never could. Suddenly, he was getting invited to exclusive clubs where senators drank scotch with men who never seemed to have job titles. Suddenly, his boss was treating him with a respect that felt like fear, and Vincent told himself he was using Isabella, that he was the one in control. But deep down in the place, he never examined too closely. He knew he was terrified of her, terrified of the way she could silence a room just by entering it, terrified of how her phone calls made grown men stammer and apologize. His friend Jake Morrison had been the first to plant the seed, sitting across from Vincent at their usual sports bar 3 months into the relationship, nursing a beer and saying, "Dude, I don't get it. Isabella's connected and all, but she's not exactly your type. I mean, she's kind of, plain." And Vincent had laughed it off at first, but the word had burrowed into his brain like a parasite. And soon he was looking at Isabella differently, noticing how she didn't wear makeup like other women, how she dressed for power instead of attention, how she commanded respect instead of desire. And Vincent's shallow soul had twisted that strength into ugliness, because he couldn't comprehend beauty that didn't exist for his consumption. He'd started saying it to his friends when Isabella wasn't around, casual comments that felt like rebellion against her quiet dominance over his life. "She's ugly but useful," he'd joke, and his friends would laugh uncomfortably because they could see what Vincent refused to acknowledge, that Isabella Corleone was stunning in the way that dangerous things are stunning, like lightning or deep water or loaded guns. Then came the charity gala 4 weeks ago, the kind of event where diamonds outnumbered stars, and every conversation was a negotiation. And Vincent had been standing by the bar, feeling bored and trapped, because Isabella was across the room talking business with men in suits that cost more than his monthly rent. And that's when he'd seen her, a woman who looked exactly like Isabella, but somehow completely different, wearing a white dress that clung to curves. Isabella kept hidden under blazers, smiling with lips painted the color of fresh blood, moving through the crowd like a dancer instead of a general. And when she'd approached him, Vincent's heart had stuttered, because for a split second, he thought Isabella had transformed into someone softer, someone he could control. "You must be Vincent," the woman had said, her voice honey-sweet where Isabella's was steel-sharp. "I'm Gabriella Draper. Isabella's told me absolutely nothing about you." Which is interesting because my sister usually tells me everything. And Vincent's brain had short-circuited on the word sister, because Isabella had never mentioned having a sister, had never mentioned having any family beyond vague references to the business. And Gabriella had smiled at his confusion like a cat watching a mouse realize it's in a cage. The affair had started that night, Gabriella's hand on his arm, her perfume different from Isabella's, her laugh designed to make men feel clever, and Vincent had thought he was getting away with something, thought he was finally taking control of his own life, sneaking around with the beautiful sister while using the powerful one. And he'd never stopped to wonder why Gabriella always knew exactly where to meet him, why she never asked him to leave Isabella, why her questions about his relationship always felt like an interrogation, disguised as pillow talk. Now sitting in this study with both sisters staring at him like judges at a trial, Vincent's mind was racing backward through every moment, every conversation, every time Gabriella had asked, "What did you tell your friends about Isabella?" Or, "Do you love her, Vincent? Really love her?" And he realized with horror that every word he'd spoken had been a confession. Every lie he'd told had been recorded. Every insult he'd whispered had been evidence in a case he didn't know was being built against him. And the worst part, the part that made his stomach turn to acid, was that he'd never actually wanted Gabriella. He'd wanted to hurt Isabella, wanted to prove he had power over someone who terrified him. And now both women knew it. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now, because what happens next is going to change everything you thought you knew about revenge. I promise you that. Vincent's mouth opened to speak, to explain, to lie his way out like he'd always done. But Isabella raised one finger, and the words died in his throat, like she'd reached in and strangled them. And that's when he noticed the guards materializing from the shadows in the doorway, 3 men in dark suits, who stood with the stillness of people who'd done terrible things and would do them again without hesitation. And Vincent's survival instincts finally kicked in, screaming that he wasn't in a relationship drama anymore. He was in something far more dangerous. "Gabriella, you said you loved me," Vincent stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. And he hated how pathetic he sounded. But fear had stripped away every layer of sophistication he'd spent years building. And Gabriella threw her head back and laughed, a sound like breaking glass, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. "I'm an actress, Vincent," Gabriella said, moving closer until she was leaning against the desk, her white suit glowing in the lamplight, like an angel of death. "I studied at Juilliard before joining the family business. Method acting, emotional manipulation, the whole package. And you were the easiest role I've ever played. You practically wrote the script yourself with every insecure word that came out of your mouth." Isabella stubbed out her cigarette in a crystal ashtray that probably cost more than Vincent's entire wardrobe, and stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown. "Every man who enters our world gets tested, Vincent. Every single one, because loyalty isn't something you can fake in our family. It's either in your blood or it isn't. And you," she paused, her dark eyes boring into him like drills, "you failed spectacularly." The room tilted sideways in Vincent's perception as the pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Every moment with Gabriella had been choreographed. Every secret he'd whispered had been recorded. Every time he'd called Isabella ugly to his friends, while Gabriella pretended to sympathize. They'd been building a case against him. And the worst part was that he'd volunteered for his own execution. "Wait, your world? What do you mean?" "Your world," Vincent asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Had always known it in the way Isabella's name made restaurant owners comp their meals, in the way parking tickets disappeared, in the way his boss had gone pale when Vincent mentioned who he was dating, and Isabella and Gabriella exchanged a look that held entire conversations Vincent would never be privy to. "The Moretti family," both sisters said in perfect unison, their voices overlapping like a curse, and Isabella continued, "We run this city, Vincent. Every politician, every judge, every business owner who matters, they all answer to us eventually. And you've been dating the heir to an empire you were too stupid to recognize. Vincent's eyes darted around the study with new understanding. Those photographs on the wall weren't networking shots. They were proof of ownership. Those men in suits weren't business partners. They were subordinates. And that antique revolver in the glass case wasn't a collector's item. It was a trophy from someone who'd learned the hard way what happened when you crossed the Moretti family. But I didn't know, Vincent started, and Gabriella cut him off with a laugh that had no humor in it. That's exactly the point. Vincent, you didn't know, because you never bothered to ask. You were too busy using Isabella's connections to climb your pathetic little corporate ladder while calling her ugly behind her back. And do you know what we do to men who disrespect the family? The question hung in the air like a noose, and Vincent's bladder felt dangerously full, and his hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the chair arms to keep them still. And somewhere in his mind, he was calculating escape routes. But the guards had moved to block the door, and the windows were 3 stories up, and besides, his legs had turned to water. This was all a setup from the beginning, Vincent whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You knew I would cheat. You wanted me to cheat. And Isabella smiled for the first time, a real smile that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. We didn't know you would cheat, Vincent. We knew you would fail. There's a difference, Isabella said, circling around behind his chair like a shark. Some men see Gabriella and stay loyal. They recognize that beauty without character is just decoration. Those men get to stay in our world. They get protection, power, everything they could want. But men like you, men who see my sister as an upgrade instead of a trap, men who measure women's worth by how they look instead of who they are, those men get exactly what they deserve. Vincent tried to stand, but one of the guards stepped forward, and the movement was enough to freeze him in place. And he realized with crystal clarity that he'd walked into a cage 6 months ago, and every choice he'd made since had just locked the door tighter. And now both sisters were staring at him with expressions that mixed contempt with something almost like pity, like he was a bug. They were about to step on but felt slightly bad about it. What are you going to do to me? Vincent asked, and his voice came out as a whimper, and he thought about his mother, who still believed he was dating a nice girl from a good family. About his apartment lease and his car payment and his 401k, all the ordinary concerns of an ordinary life that suddenly seemed impossibly precious now that they were about to be taken away. Isabella leaned down until her face was inches from his, close enough that he could smell her perfume, the same perfume she'd worn on their first date when he'd already been planning how to use her, and she whispered, "That depends entirely on what you do next, Vincent, because right now you're at a crossroads. You can accept your punishment with dignity, or you can make this much, much worse for yourself. So I'm going to ask you one question, and your answer will determine whether you walk out of this room or get carried out. Do you understand?" Vincent nodded, because speech had abandoned him entirely. And if you're watching this thinking, you know how this ends, drop a comment below with your prediction. Because I guarantee you're wrong. This story is about to take a turn that will leave you absolutely shook. And Isabella's question, the question that would decide Vincent Romana's fate, hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. "Do you love my sister?" Isabella asked, and the question landed like a bomb in the quiet study, and Vincent's mind raced through every possible answer, like a rat in a maze, knowing that each path might lead to his destruction, and he opened his mouth. But Isabella held up her hand again. "Wait! Before you answer, let me tell you what happens if you lie. We have recordings, Vincent. Every phone call you made to your friends calling me ugly. Every text message you sent Gabriella talking about how you were playing us both. Every conversation where you laughed about using my family's name to get ahead. So think very carefully before you speak, because this is the only chance you get to tell the truth. Vincent felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, because he wasn't sure he had one anymore, but something deeper. The foundation of lies he'd built his entire adult life on. And for the first time in 6 months, he looked at Isabella, really looked at her, and saw what he'd been too blind and stupid to see before. The intelligence in her dark eyes that could run an empire. The strength in her posture that came from carrying responsibilities he couldn't imagine. The beauty that existed in competence and power, and the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet. And he realized with crushing clarity that he'd called this woman ugly because her beauty terrified him, because it demanded he be better than he was, because loving her would have required him to actually become someone worth loving. No, Vincent said, and the word came out broken. No, I don't love you. I never did. I used you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And tears were streaming down his face now, hot and shameful. And he wasn't crying because he thought it would save him. He was crying because for the first time in his life, he was seeing himself clearly, and the reflection was hideous. Gabriella moved from the desk to stand beside her sister, and in that moment Vincent saw what he'd missed before. They weren't just twins. They were two halves of the same weapon. Isabella the steel blade, and Gabriella the poisoned honey. And together they were unstoppable, and he'd been so focused on their services that he'd never seen the depth beneath. At least you're honest now, Gabriella said, and her voice had lost its seductive sweetness. Now she sounded like Isabella, cold and precise. Do you know why we really tested you, Vincent? It wasn't just about loyalty to Isabella. It was about character. About whether you were the kind of man who could see value in a woman beyond her appearance. Whether you could recognize power when it didn't come wrapped in a pretty package. And you failed on every level. Isabella walked to the window, her silhouette backlit by the city lights beyond. And Vincent could see the skyline of Manhattan spread out behind her like a kingdom. And he understood now that she didn't just live in this city, she owned it. And he'd been playing checkers while she played chess with human lives. I'm going to tell you something, Vincent, and I want you to really hear it, Isabella said without turning around. Every woman in our family gets tested too. We get tested every single day by men who think we're just decoration, by rivals who underestimate us because of our gender, by a world that wants to put us in boxes labeled wife or mistress or trophy. And we survive by being smarter, stronger, more ruthless than any man who challenges us. And when I met you, I thought maybe, just maybe, you might be different. Vincent's throat felt like it was closing, and he wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd been raised to value the wrong things, that society had taught him to measure women by impossible standards. But he knew those were just more excuses, more lies. And the truth was that he'd had 6 months to see who Isabella really was, and he'd chosen blindness because seeing her clearly would have required him to change, and change was harder than cruelty. What happens now? Vincent asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. And Isabella finally turned from the window, and in the lamplight, her face looked almost sad, like she'd hoped for a different outcome, even though she'd known how it would end. Now you make a choice, Isabella said, moving back to the desk where a manila folder sat that Vincent hadn't noticed before, thick with papers that looked like legal documents. You can walk away from this city, from your job, from everyone you know. Start over somewhere else with nothing but the clothes on your back, and the knowledge that if you ever speak about this family, or what happened here tonight, we will find you, and the consequences will be severe. Or, she paused, opening the folder to reveal photographs that made Vincent's blood run cold. Pictures of him with Gabriella, time-stamped and dated. Evidence of an affair that would destroy his reputation, his career, everything he'd worked for. Or, you can work for us, Gabriella continued. And now both sisters were standing side by side, mirror images of power. You can spend the next 5 years doing whatever we ask. No questions, no complaints, proving that maybe you can learn loyalty even if you couldn't learn love. And if you survive that, if you prove yourself useful, then maybe, just maybe, we'll let you have a life again. Vincent looked between the two options: exile or servitude, freedom with nothing or slavery with the hope of redemption, and he realized this was the real test. Not the affair, not the loyalty, but this moment right here where he had to choose between his pride and his survival. And for the first time in his life, Vincent Romano understood what it meant to face consequences he couldn't charm or lie his way out of. And if you think you know which choice he makes, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about transformation, and these two queens are about to teach Vincent a lesson he'll never forget. So make sure you're subscribed, because the next part is where everything changes. "I'll work for you," Vincent said, and the words tasted like ashes in his mouth, but also strangely like relief, like finally stopping running from something that was always going to catch him anyway. And Isabella nodded once, sharp and final, like a judge passing sentence. And she gestured to one of the guards who stepped forward with a leather portfolio that looked older than Vincent's entire bloodline. "Sign here, here, and here," Isabella said, flipping through pages of legal documents written in language so dense Vincent couldn't parse it even if his hands weren't shaking. "This is a 5-year contract. You'll work directly under Gabriella in our legitimate business operations. Event planning, client relations, the public face of Moretti Enterprises. And Vincent, if you think this is mercy, let me be clear, this is harder than exile. Because every single day you'll see what you could have had if you'd been a better man." Vincent signed his name 3 times, each signature feeling like he was signing away a piece of his soul. And when he looked up, Gabriella was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, something between contempt and curiosity, like he was a science experiment she wasn't sure would survive. And she said, "You start Monday, 9 a.m. sharp, and Vincent, don't be late. Punctuality is the only form of respect you have left to offer." The guards melted back into the shadows, and suddenly the room felt smaller, more intimate. Just Vincent and the 2 sisters who'd orchestrated his complete destruction and reconstruction in the span of 6 months. And Isabella poured herself another scotch, her movements precise and controlled. And Vincent realized he'd never seen her lose control of anything. Not once. And that kind of discipline was its own form of beauty he'd been too shallow to appreciate. "Can I ask you something?" Vincent said, and his voice cracked on the words, and Isabella raised an eyebrow but nodded, and Vincent took a breath and asked a question that had been burning in his mind since the moment the trap closed. "Why go through all this? Why not just end the relationship when you knew I was cheating? Why the elaborate test?" The sisters exchanged another one of those loaded glances, and then Isabella did something Vincent had never seen before. She sat down, not in the power position behind the desk, but in the chair next to him, close enough that he could see the faint scar on her left cheekbone that makeup usually covered. And when she spoke, her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something raw and real that made Vincent's chest ache. "Our father," Isabella began, and Gabriella moved to stand behind her sister's chair, one hand resting on Isabella's shoulder, in a gesture of support that spoke of shared trauma. "Giovanni Moretti, he built this empire from nothing, came to America with $5 and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. And he was brilliant, ruthless, everything a man in his position needed to be. But he had one weakness. He fell in love with our mother, Sophia, and she was beautiful. Graceman, the kind of beautiful that made men stupid, and our father became stupid." Vincent listened, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever spell had made Isabella vulnerable enough to share this. And Gabriella picked up the story. Her voice soft, but carrying an undercurrent of old anger. Our mother was a con artist. She married our father for his money and power, and for 10 years she played the perfect wife, while secretly funneling millions to her real family, the Russos, our father's biggest rivals. And when he finally discovered the truth, when he finally saw past her beauty to the betrayal underneath, it nearly destroyed him, destroyed the family, started a war that killed dozens of our people. Isabella's hand trembled slightly as she raised the scotch to her lips, and Vincent saw something in her eyes he'd never expected to see. Pain, deep and old and never fully healed. And she continued, "Our father made us promise, both of us, that we would never let beauty blind us the way it blinded him, that we would test any man who entered our world, that we would be smarter than he was. And so we created the twin test. Gabriella plays the beautiful temptation. I play the powerful reality. And we see which one men choose. And Vincent, you're the 47th man we've tested in the last 8 years." The number hit Vincent like a physical blow. 47 men, 47 tests. And he asked the question, even though he was terrified of the answer. How many passed? And Gabriella's laugh was bitter as winter wind. 3. Vincent, 3 men in 8 years saw past the surface, chose loyalty over lust, chose character over beauty, and those 3 men are now our most trusted advisors. They run our operations in Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles. They have power and wealth and respect, and they earned it by being better than you. Vincent felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the seed of it. Because if 3 men had passed, then maybe redemption wasn't impossible. Maybe 5 years of service could teach him to be the kind of man who deserved to be in the same room as these women. And he looked at Isabella and saw her differently now. Not just as the woman he'd used and betrayed, but as someone who'd been betrayed by her own mother, who'd built walls around her heart not from coldness, but from survival, who tested men because her father's broken heart had taught her that beauty without loyalty was poison. "Your mother," Vincent said carefully. "What happened to her?" And the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and Isabella's face became a mask again, all vulnerability locked away behind steel. And she said in a voice that could cut glass, "She's alive. Living in Sicily under a new name. Our father loved her too much to kill her, but he exiled her forever. And every day she lives knowing she destroyed the only man who ever really loved her. And that, Vincent, is a worse punishment than death." Gabriella moved around to face Vincent directly, and in the lamplight, he could see that she and Isabella weren't just identical in appearance. They were identical in the way trauma had shaped them. 2 women who'd learned to weaponize beauty and power because their mother had taught them that one without the other was worthless. And Gabriella said, "So now you understand. This isn't just about you, Vincent. This is about every man who thinks he can use us. Every man who sees Isabella's power and wants to exploit it. Every man who sees my beauty and thinks it makes me weak. And you're going to spend 5 years learning why that thinking is not just wrong, but dangerous." Vincent nodded, and for the first time since entering the study, he felt something other than fear. He felt purpose, twisted and dark as it was, because these women had given him a chance that 44 other men hadn't gotten. A chance to prove he could evolve beyond the shallow creature he'd been. And if you're watching this thinking the story's over, you're so wrong. Because Vincent's 5 years of service are about to reveal secrets about the Moretti family that will change everything. So hit that like button and drop a comment telling me if you think Vincent can actually change, or if some men are beyond redemption, because what happens next will test that question in ways you cannot imagine. 3 months into his servitude, and Vincent Romano had learned that hell wasn't fire and brimstone. It was a corner office on the 42nd floor where Gabriella Moretti assigned him tasks specifically designed to break him. And today's assignment was the worst yet. planned the annual Moretti Foundation Gala, where Isabella would be honored for her charitable work. The same gala where Vincent would have to smile and serve champagne to every person he'd ever bragged to about dating her. Every colleague who'd heard him call her ugly. Every friend who'd laughed at his jokes about using her connections. "The guest list is on your desk," Gabriella said, without looking up from her laptop, her voice carrying that particular tone of indifference that hurt worse than anger. 500 people. Gracemen, including the mayor, 3 senators, and every major business owner in Manhattan. And Vincent. Your ex-girlfriend Sarah will be there with her new fiancé. I made sure to send them a personal invitation. Vincent's hands clenched into fists under the desk, because Sarah was the girl he'd dated before Isabella. The girl he'd actually loved, or thought he loved. The girl who'd left him because she said he was too ambitious, too willing to compromise his values for success. And she'd been right. She'd seen what he was before he'd fully become it. And now she'd witness his complete humiliation. The worst part wasn't the tasks themselves. Vincent had planned events before. He knew how to coordinate caterers and florists and security. The worst part was that he was good at it. Better than he'd ever been at his corporate job, because now he had something to prove. And every perfectly arranged centerpiece, every flawlessly timed speech, every detail executed with precision was another brick in the wall of his redemption. But the wall felt impossibly high, and he was so tired of climbing. "Isabella wants to see you," Gabriella said, and those 4 words sent ice through Vincent's veins, because in 3 months he'd barely seen Isabella. She'd made herself scarce, delegating his supervision entirely to Gabriella. And Vincent had told himself it was better this way, easier to forget what he'd lost if he didn't have to see her. But the truth was that her absence haunted him worse than her presence ever could. Isabella's office was on the top floor, floor 45, and the elevator ride felt like ascending to judgment. And when Vincent entered, Isabella was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun, and she didn't turn around when she spoke. "I've been reviewing your work, Vincent. You're exceeding expectations. Gabriella says you're the best assistant she's ever had. Efficient, detail-oriented, never complaining, and that concerns me." Vincent's stomach dropped because praise from Isabella felt like a trap, and he waited, barely breathing, and Isabella finally turned, and the sunlight caught her face in a way that made Vincent's chest ache. And she looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, like carrying the weight of her empire was finally showing cracks. And she said, "You're performing well, because you're still performing. You're playing the role of the reformed man, the loyal servant. But I don't know if you've actually changed, or if you've just gotten better at lying." The words hit Vincent like bullets, each one finding a target he didn't know was exposed. And he wanted to defend himself, to prove that the last 3 months had transformed him, that every day of service had stripped away another layer of the shallow creature he'd been. But how do you prove sincerity to someone who's been betrayed by a master manipulator? How do you show truth to someone whose mother was a professional liar? And Vincent realized with crushing despair that maybe he couldn't. Maybe some betrayals cut too deep to ever heal. "There's something else," Isabella said, moving to her desk where a manila folder sat. "Different from the one 3 months ago, but just as ominous. We have a situation. The Russo family, my mother's family. They've learned about you, about our arrangement, and they see an opportunity. They've approached you, Vincent, or they're going to offer you money, protection, a way out of your contract if you spy on us. Feed them information about our operations. And this is your real test." Vincent felt the floor tilt beneath him, because he hadn't been approached by anyone, hadn't received any suspicious calls or messages. And he said, "No one's contacted me. I swear. I would have told you immediately." And Isabella's smile was sad and knowing. "They will, Vincent." Probably tonight. They've been watching you for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And when they make their offer, you'll have a choice: betray us and gain your freedom, or stay loyal and prove that maybe, just maybe, you've actually changed. The room felt like it was closing in, and Vincent understood now that the last 3 months had been preparation, not redemption. The sisters had been training him, testing him, building him up so that when the Russos knocked him down, the fall would reveal what he was really made of. And Isabella opened the folder to show surveillance photos. Vincent leaving his apartment, Vincent at the grocery store, Vincent at the gym. Dozens of photos taken by people he'd never noticed. And she said, "They know everything about you, your routines, your weaknesses, your ex-girlfriend Sarah. They know she'll be at the gala. They know you still have feelings for her, and they'll use that. They'll use everything." Vincent's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Because if the Russos approached him and he refused, they might hurt him. But if he accepted and told Isabella, she might not believe him, might think he was playing both sides. And if he accepted and didn't tell Isabella, he'd become exactly what she feared: another beautiful liar, another betrayer. And there was no winning move, no path that didn't lead to destruction. "Why are you telling me this?" Vincent asked, his voice barely a whisper. And Isabella's eyes held something that might have been regret, or might have been resignation. "Because I'm giving you the choice. My father never gave my mother. I'm telling you the trap exists before you walk into it. And if you still betray us, at least I'll know you did it with full knowledge of the consequences. And Vincent, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, but for everyone you care about. Your mother in Queens, your sister in Boston, your friend Marcus, who co-signed your first apartment lease. The Russos don't play games, and neither do we." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, and Vincent felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his hope, because he'd spent 3 months believing that hard work and loyalty could earn him redemption. But now he understood that the sisters would never fully trust him, could never fully trust him, because their mother's betrayal had taught them that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, and he was trapped in a cage of his own making. Damned if he betrayed them, and damned if he stayed loyal, because loyalty without trust was just another form of slavery. "When?" Vincent asked, and Isabella checked her watch. "A Patek Philippe. That probably cost more than Vincent would make in 5 years of servitude." "Tonight, probably around 8 p.m. They'll approach you at Murphy's Bar, the place you go every Thursday. They've been very thorough in their surveillance. And Vincent, whatever you decide, know that I hoped you'd be different. I hoped you'd be one of the 3 who passed. But hope is dangerous in our world. It makes you weak, and I can't afford to be weak." Isabella dismissed him with a wave, and Vincent walked to the elevator in a daze. And as the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the polished steel, and the man staring back looked hollow, broken, a ghost of the confident corporate climber who'd walked into Isabella's life 6 months ago, and he wondered if this was what transformation felt like. The complete destruction of who you were before you could become who you needed to be. And if you're still watching this, drop a comment and tell me what you'd do in Vincent's position. Because in 8 hours he'll face a choice that will determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone he loves. And I promise you, what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Murphy's Bar at 7:45 p.m. was exactly as Vincent remembered. Dark wood and darker secrets, the kind of place where deals got made and lives got ruined. And Vincent sat in his usual corner booth, nursing a whiskey he hadn't touched because he needed his mind sharp for whatever was coming, and at exactly 8 p.m., the door opened, and 2 men walked in, wearing suits too expensive for this neighborhood. And Vincent knew, without being told, that these were the Russos. And the older one, silver-haired with eyes like a shark, slid into the booth across from him and said, Vincent Romano, we've been looking forward to meeting you. The younger one stood guard, blocking the exit, and Vincent felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Probably Isabella or Gabriella, checking if he was still alive, still loyal, still worth the gamble they'd taken on him. And the silver-haired man introduced himself as Carlo Russo, cousin to Sofia Moretti, the woman who'd betrayed Giovanni and broken his heart. And Carlo smiled like a wolf and said, "We know everything, Vincent. We know about your contract, your servitude, your desperate attempt to prove you're not the shallow bastard you actually are, and we're here to offer you freedom." Vincent's hand tightened around the whiskey glass, and he forced himself to meet Carlo's eyes. And he said, "What do you want?" And Carlo's smile widened. "Information, Vincent. Just information. The Morettis are planning something big, an expansion into digital currency that will make them untouchable. And we need to know the details, the timeline, the partners involved. And in exchange, we'll pay off your contract, give you $2 million, and set you up in Los Angeles, where you can start fresh. No more servitude, no more guilt. Just freedom and money and a chance to be the man you were before Isabella Moretti ruined you." The offer hung in the air like temptation itself. And Vincent thought about his mother working double shifts at the hospital, his sister struggling with student loans, his friend Marcus who'd believed in him when no one else did. And $2 million could change all their lives. Could erase the financial stress that had driven Vincent to compromise his values in the first place. And for a moment, just a moment, Vincent considered it. But then something shifted in his chest, something that had been growing for 3 months of service. And he realized that Carlo had made a crucial mistake in his pitch. He'd said Isabella had ruined Vincent, but the truth was that Isabella had saved him, had given him a mirror to see what he'd become, and a chance to become something better. And Vincent looked at Carlo Russo and said, "No." The word came out stronger than Vincent expected, and Carlo's smile faltered, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Think carefully, Vincent. We know where your mother works. We know your sister's apartment number. We know that Marcus has a gambling problem he's been hiding, and if you refuse us, if you choose the Morettis over your own freedom, then everyone you love becomes collateral damage in a war you can't win." Vincent felt fear spike through him, cold and sharp. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt like courage, or maybe just clarity. And he pulled out his phone, not to call for help, but to show Carlo the screen. And on it was a recording app that had been running since 7:30 p.m., capturing every word of Carlo's threats, his admission of surveillance, his offer of blood money. And Vincent said, "I'm not the man I was 6 months ago. I'm not even the man I was 3 months ago. And maybe I'll never fully earn Isabella's trust. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed. But I'd rather spend my life trying to be worthy of her than spend one more second being the kind of man who betrays people for money." Carlo's face went dark with rage, and the younger Russo moved forward, hand reaching inside his jacket. And Vincent knew he was about to die or get beaten or worse. But then the door to Murphy's bar exploded open, and Isabella walked in, not alone but flanked by 6 security personnel who moved with military precision, and she was wearing all black, her hair pulled back, and she looked like an avenging angel. She said in a voice that could freeze Hill, "Carlo Russo, you're trespassing on Moretti territory, threatening my employee, and violating the treaty your family signed 8 years ago. And I have every right to end you right here, right now." The bar had gone silent. Every patron suddenly very interested in their drinks, and Carlo raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes were calculating, looking for an exit. And Isabella moved closer, and Vincent saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not anger, but something fiercer, something protective. And she said, "But I'm not going to kill you, Carlo, because Vincent just gave me something more valuable than your life. He gave me proof that the Russos are actively trying to sabotage our operations, violating the peace treaty, and that means your family owes us reparations, and I'm going to collect. Carlo and his associate were escorted out by Isabella's security, and suddenly the bar was just Vincent and Isabella, standing 3 feet apart in the dim light, and Vincent's hands were shaking from adrenaline. And Isabella looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, and she said, "You recorded them." And Vincent nodded. "I recorded them. I knew they were coming. You told me they were coming. And I thought if I could get evidence, proof that I chose you over them, then maybe you'd believe I've changed." Isabella took the phone from Vincent's hand, her fingers brushing his, and she listened to the recording. And when Carlo's voice threatened Vincent's family, something flickered across her face, and she looked up at Vincent and said, "You could have taken the money. You could have run. You could have protected your family by betraying us. But you chose the harder path. The path that put everyone you love at risk. And Vincent, that's either the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the stupidest, and I can't decide which." Vincent laughed, and it came out half sob, and he said, "Probably both. But Isabella, I need you to know something. These 3 months, they haven't been punishment, they've been education. You and Gabriella have taught me what real power looks like, what real beauty looks like. And it's not what I thought. It's not surface or charm or manipulation. It's strength and loyalty, and the courage to test people even when testing them means risking your own heart. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm asking anyway because for the first time in my life, I've met someone who makes me want to be better. And that someone is you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 3 months of distance and 6 months of betrayal, and a lifetime of Isabella's walls built from her mother's lies. And then Isabella did something that shocked Vincent more than anything that had happened that night. She closed the distance between them, and she took his face in her hands, and she said, "My mother, Sophia. She didn't just betray my father for money, Vincent. She betrayed him because she never learned to see past her own reflection. She was so beautiful that everyone told her she was special, that she deserved everything, and she believed them, and it made her hollow. And when I look at you now, I see someone who's learning to see past his own reflection, and that's rare, that's valuable, and maybe, just maybe, that's worth trusting." Isabella kissed him then, and it wasn't the passionate kiss of romance novels. It was something deeper. Something that tasted like forgiveness and hope, and the terrifying vulnerability of two people who'd both been betrayed choosing to trust anyway. And when they pulled apart, Vincent saw tears on Isabella's cheeks, and she said, "You have 2 more years in your contract, Vincent. But I'm changing the terms. You're not my employee anymore. You're my partner. In business and in everything else. If you want to be. If you're brave enough to love a woman who might never fully trust you, who might test you for the rest of your life, who comes with an empire and enemies and more baggage than any sane person would accept." Vincent pulled her close, and he said, "I'm not sane. I'm in love. And if you're watching this and you think the story's over, you're wrong. Because Vincent and Isabella are about to face the biggest threat yet. The return of Sophia Moretti from exile, and she's coming back with secrets that will tear the family apart. So smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because part 8 is going to blow your mind." The Moretti Foundation Gala was in full swing. 500 of Manhattan's elites sipping champagne under crystal chandeliers. And Vincent stood beside Isabella in a tailored Tom Ford suit she'd insisted on buying him, no longer her servant, but her partner. And the transformation in how people treated him was almost comical. The same colleagues who'd pitied him now sought his attention. The same friends who'd mocked him now asked for introductions. But Vincent barely noticed, because his eyes kept scanning the crowd for threats. For Russos. For anything that might hurt the woman who'd given him a second chance at becoming human. Isabella was radiant in a crimson gown, that matched the color palette of their viral thumbnail concept. Her hair swept up to reveal the scar on her cheekbone she no longer bothered hiding. And when she took the stage to accept her humanitarian award, Vincent felt his chest swell with something that might have been pride, or might have been love, or might have been both. And she spoke about second chances, about how her foundation focused on rehabilitating people society had written off, and Vincent understood that her speech was partly about him, partly about her own journey of learning to trust again. Gabriella appeared at Vincent's elbow, stunning in an identical crimson gown, because the twins had decided to make a statement tonight. And she whispered, "North entrance, 3 o'clock. We have a problem." And Vincent followed her gaze to see a woman entering the ballroom, and even from across the room he could see the resemblance. The same bone structure as the twins, but older, refined by time and exile, and Sophia Moretti had returned. The room seemed to freeze, or maybe that was just Vincent's perception, because Sophia moved through the crowd like a shark through water, elegant and dangerous, and people parted for her instinctively, sensing predator even if they didn't know her history. And Isabella's speech faltered mid-sentence, her eyes finding her mother's across the ballroom, and the microphone picked up her sharp intake of breath. And then Isabella did something that shocked everyone. She smiled, cold and calculated, and she said into the microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest tonight. My mother, Sophia Moretti, who's been living in Sicily for the past 8 years. Please, Mother, join me on stage." Sophia's mask of confidence cracked for just a moment, because she'd clearly planned to make a dramatic entrance on her own terms, not be called out publicly, but she recovered quickly and glided to the stage. And when she took the microphone, her voice was honey and poison mixed. "My darling daughters, I've missed you so much, and I've come home to make amends, to reveal truths that have been hidden too long. Truths about your father, about the Rousseau family, about the real reason I left." Vincent's instinct screamed danger, and he moved closer to the stage, and Gabriella was already signaling security. But Isabella held up a hand, stopping everyone, and she said, "Please, Mother, enlighten us. Tell everyone here the truths you've been hiding." And Sophia's smile was triumphant because she thought she'd won, thought she'd regained control, and she said, "Your father, Giovanni Moretti, he wasn't the saint you think he was. He built his empire on blood and betrayal, and the Rousseaus, they weren't my family by choice. They were my family by force. Giovanni killed my real father and forced me to marry him, and everything I did, every dollar I funneled to the Rousseaus was revenge for the man he murdered." The ballroom erupted in whispers, cameras flashing, society reporters salivating over the scandal, and Vincent saw Isabella's face, saw the moment of doubt, the crack in her armor, because what if her mother was telling the truth? What if everything she'd built her identity on was a lie? But then Gabriella stepped forward, and she was holding a tablet, and she connected it to the projection screen behind the stage. And suddenly the ballroom was watching security footage, old and grainy, but clear enough. And it showed a younger Sophia in a hotel room with Carlo Russo, not forced, not coerced, but laughing, planning, counting money. And the timestamp was from before she'd married Giovanni, and Gabriella's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mother, you're a talented liar, but you forgot that father kept records of everything, including the private investigator reports from before he married you. You weren't forced into anything. You were a con artist who saw an opportunity. And this footage is from 6 months before the wedding, you and Carlo planning how to infiltrate and destroy the Moretti family." Sophia's face went white, then red, and she lunged for the tablet, but Isabella caught her wrist, and for the first time in 8 years, mother and daughter were face to face, and Isabella said quietly, so only those on stage could hear, "You taught me everything, Mother. You taught me that beauty without character is worthless. That trust is earned, not given. That some people will destroy everything good in their lives because they can't see past their own reflection. And I'm grateful, because your betrayal made me strong enough to build something you never could. A real empire based on loyalty and respect, not lies and manipulation. Sophia jerked her hand free, and she looked at the crowd, at the cameras, at the evidence of her lies projected for everyone to see. And she did what she'd always done. She ran, fled the ballroom in her designer heels. And security didn't stop her because Isabella had made her point, had exposed her mother not with violence, but with truth. And as Sophia disappeared into the Manhattan night, Vincent realized that this was the real climax. Not a physical confrontation, but a moral one. The moment when Isabella chose to be better than the woman who'd birthed her. The gala continued. Awkward at first, but then energized by the drama, because Manhattan society loved nothing more than a scandal with a clear villain. And Isabella finished her speech, thanked everyone for their support. And when she left the stage, she walked straight to Vincent, and she kissed him in front of 500 people. In front of cameras and reporters, and everyone who'd ever doubted that she could love or be loved. And she whispered against his lips, "Thank you for being here, for standing with me, for being the kind of man who records conversations and chooses loyalty over money. You're one of the three now, Vincent. One of the ones who passed the test, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Vincent held her close, and over her shoulder he saw Gabriella watching them. And for the first time since he'd met her, Gabriella was smiling, really smiling, and she raised her champagne glass in a toast. And Vincent understood that he'd been accepted, not just by Isabella, but by the family. And later that night, after the gala ended and the guests departed and the ballroom was empty except for staff cleaning up, Isabella took Vincent to her father's study, the same room where he'd signed his contract. And Giovanni Moretti was there, older than Vincent expected, white-haired and tired, but still carrying the weight of empire in his shoulders. And he looked at Vincent and said, "My daughters tell me you're the real thing, that you chose them over money, over safety, over the easy path. And Vincent, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. When Sophia betrayed me, when I discovered what she'd done, I didn't exile her because I was merciful. I exiled her because killing her would have made me like her, would have proven that love turns people into monsters. But you've proven the opposite, that love can turn monsters into men, and for that, you have my blessing." Giovanni extended his hand, and Vincent shook it, and he felt the weight of approval from a man who'd built an empire and lost a wife and raised 2 daughters to be stronger than their trauma. And if you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me if Sophia deserved worse, or if exile was the perfect punishment, because Part 9 is going to jump forward 6 months to show you Vincent and Isabella's life together, the challenges of loving a mafia queen, and one final twist that will change everything you thought you knew about this story. 6 months after the gala, Vincent Romano stood in the executive boardroom of Moretti Enterprises, not as an assistant or a servant, but as chief strategy officer. And the irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd once used Isabella for her connections now genuinely earned his place at her table. And across from him sat Gabriella, chief operations officer, and at the head of the table was Isabella, CEO, and together the three of them had transformed the company, expanding into ethical tech investments, cryptocurrency with transparency protocols, and a foundation that had rehabilitated 47 people society had written off. People like Vincent, who'd made terrible choices but deserved second chances. The morning meeting ended, and as executives filed out, Isabella caught Vincent's hand and she said, "My father wants to see us, both of us. He says it's important." And there was something in her voice that made Vincent nervous, because Giovanni Moretti didn't summon people unless it mattered. And when they arrived at his estate in Westchester, the old man was in his garden, tending roses with the same precision he'd once used to build an empire. and he looked up at them and smiled. And Vincent saw where Isabella got her ability to make a smile feel like both a gift and a test. Sit, Giovanni said, gesturing to the wrought iron chairs beside him, and they sat. And Giovanni poured 3 glasses of wine from a bottle that probably cost more than Vincent's first car, and he said, Isabella, Vincent, I'm retiring, effective immediately. The company is yours, both of yours. Equal partnership, 50-50. And before you argue, before you tell me I'm needed, understand that I've spent 30 years building an empire. And I'm tired. And I want to spend whatever time I have left watching my daughters be happy. And Vincent, that includes you now, your family. Not by blood, but by choice. Which is stronger? Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and she tried to hide them, but Vincent saw, and he took her hand, and Giovanni continued. There's something else. Something I need to tell you both about your mother, Isabella. About why I really exiled her instead of killing her. And it's not what you think. It's not mercy or weakness. It's because 8 years ago, when I discovered her betrayal, when I had her in front of me ready to end it, she told me she was pregnant. Not with my child, but with Carla Russo's child. And she begged me to spare her for the baby's sake. And I did. I exiled her to Sicily, where she had the child, a daughter. And that daughter is 7 years old now. And she's innocent. And she's your half-sister. And I've been supporting her financially through intermediaries, making sure she has everything she needs. Education, safety, a life away from our world. The revelation hit like a bomb, and Isabella's hand tightened around Vincent's, and she said, A sister. I have another sister, and you never told us, Father. Why? Why would you keep this from us? And Giovanni's face showed every one of his 68 years, and he said, Because I didn't want you to feel obligated to love a child born from betrayal. Didn't want you to carry that burden. But she's 7 now, and she's asking questions about her family. And Sophia, your mother, she's not capable of raising her properly. She's still the same narcissist she always was. And I'm asking you, both of you, if you'd consider bringing her here, raising her as your own, giving her the family she deserves. Vincent looked at Isabella, and he saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between the hurt of her mother's betrayal and the innocence of a child who didn't choose her parents. And he said quietly, Isabella, this isn't my decision. She's your blood. But if you want my opinion, I think every child deserves what you and Gabriella had. A father who loves them, and sisters who protect them. And if we can give her that, if we can break the cycle of abandonment and betrayal, then maybe that's the real victory. Not defeating your mother, but being better than her. Isabella was crying now, really crying, and she looked at her father and said, What's her name? And Giovanni smiled, and he said, Lucia. Her name is Lucia Moretti, and she has your eyes, Isabella, and Gabriella's smile, and she deserves to know her sisters. 3 months later, Vincent and Isabella stood in the arrivals terminal at JFK, and Gabriella was with them. And when the little girl came through customs holding a social worker's hand, Vincent saw Isabella's breath catch. Because Giovanni was right. Lucia had Isabella's dark eyes and Gabriella's smile, and she was tiny and scared, and clutching a stuffed rabbit like it was the only solid thing in her world. And when Isabella knelt down and said, Hi, Lucia. I'm your sister Isabella, and this is your sister Gabriella, and we're so happy you're here. The little girl looked at them with those dark Moretti eyes and said, Are you going to send me away like Mama did? And Isabella pulled her into a hug, and she said, Never. We're never sending you away. You're home now. You're family. The apartment they'd prepared for Lucia was in their building, connected to both Isabella's and Gabriella's penthouses, and they decorated it with input from child psychologists, soft colors, and safe spaces, and everything a 7-year-old who'd been abandoned by her mother might need. And that first night, After Lucia fell asleep clutching her rabbit, Isabella and Vincent sat on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, and Isabella said, I never thought I'd be a mother. Never thought I could be. I was too damaged, too much like her. But Vincent, when I look at Lucia, I don't see my mother's betrayal. I see a chance to be different, to give her what I had, what my father gave me and Gabriella, and I'm terrified I'll fail her. Vincent pulled Isabella close, and he said, You won't fail her, because you know what failure looks like. You lived through your mother's version of it. And that knowledge, that awareness, it's your superpower. And Isabella, you're not doing this alone. You have Gabriella, you have your father, you have me. And together, we're going to give Lucia something your mother never had. A family that chooses love over selfishness. 6 months after Lucia arrived, the Moretti family gathered for Sunday dinner at Giovanni's estate. And Lucia was laughing, really laughing, as Gabriella taught her to make pasta, and Giovanni watched with tears in his eyes. And Isabella leaned against Vincent, and she said, You know what's funny? 6 months ago, I was testing you, pushing you, waiting for you to fail like everyone else. And now I can't imagine my life without you. You've become the center of everything. My partner, my conscience, my home. Vincent kissed her temple, and he said, You saved me, Isabella. You took a shallow, manipulative bastard and gave him a reason to be better. And every day I wake up grateful that you saw something in me worth saving. And I promise you, I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you were right. Isabella turned to face him, and she pulled a small velvet box from her pocket. And Vincent's heart stopped, and she said, Vincent Romano, you've already proven it. You've proven it every day for the past year. And I know this isn't traditional. I know the woman isn't supposed to propose. But we've never been traditional, and I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to waste another day not being your wife. So will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything, forever? Vincent's vision blurred with tears, and he said yes. And he kissed her. And across the kitchen, Gabriella started crying. And Lucia asked why everyone was crying. And Giovanni laughed and said, Because sometimes, little one, happy endings are so beautiful they hurt. And as the Moretti family celebrated, as Vincent slipped the ring on his finger and held the woman who'd transformed his life, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the shallow corporate climber who'd called a woman ugly to the man who'd learned that real beauty was strength and loyalty and the courage to change. And he knew that this wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of a life built on trust earned and love chosen, and the understanding that some tests never end. They just become part of who you are. And if you've watched this entire story, if you've followed Vincent and Isabella from betrayal to redemption to love, then drop a comment and tell me what lesson you're taking away. Because this story isn't just about mafia queens and second chances. It's about the truth that we're all capable of change if we find someone who believes we're worth the effort. And don't forget to subscribe to Stella's Love Tales, because next week I'm bringing you a story about a billionaire CEO who falls for the janitor who's actually an undercover FBI agent. And trust me, you won't want to miss it.